here loves to people watch? Anyone? I love people watching, which is probably why I got my degree in psychology, because I've just always wondered why people do the things that they do. And there are some places that you go and you just know, like, I'm going to get a good show today, right? Like maybe you've gone to Walmart and you've experienced something like this. Listen, I grew up in a farm town and not once did I see a horse in the grocery store. So there are truly some things that psychology cannot explain. But there are some really incredible studies that have been done and findings in psychology that are directly related to spiritual practices. And some examples of spiritual practices would be worship, prayer, fasting, silence and solitude, and service. And these practices are things that have been done within the church for centuries as people learn to follow Jesus. And these studies that have been done on the effects of these spiritual practices, they really help us to understand what happens in the brain as people practice becoming like Jesus. And it used to be believed in psychology that your brain was forming and shaped by your experiences as you learned up until a certain age. And then you're just done. Like your personality is stuck, you're locked in. Have you heard the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Like that was the idea, okay? That your brain was forming, you were learning, and then once you hit adulthood, done. That's who you are, no changing. But in the early 2000s, that idea actually changed, and research showed that the brain has something called neuroplasticity. And that just means that the brain has the ability to change with experiences as you learn through experience. So everyone pause with me right now and think about a time that you tried something new. I think back to when I was a kid learning how to ride a bike. My brain did not know as a kid the actions needed to be able to ride a bike. Babies, when they're born, don't know how to ride a bike. They can't even hold their head up when they're born. And so as a kid, my brain didn't know the movements necessary to balance and pedal a bike. But over time, with experience, with repetition, practice, falling down, getting back up again, my brain took in all of these experiences and learned the actions needed to be able to balance and pedal on a bike. That's the idea of neuroplasticity, that over time your experiences shape your brain and you learn what's needed to accomplish the task at hand. Now, a study was done by a guy named Andrew Newberg on the effects of prayer and worship on the brain. They took two groups of people, one group that considered themselves to be highly religious and prayed often, and another group of people who never prayed and wouldn't consider themselves religious at all. And they performed brain scans on each group at the beginning of the study and at the end, and what they found was pretty incredible. For the group that never prayed, there wasn't much change. They were not better or worse than when they started. But for the group that did pray, what they found was that there was more activity in the frontal lobe of the brain. And the frontal lobe makes up 2/3 of the brain, and it's responsible for your personality, it's responsible for your mood, for your decision making, for your moral reasoning. And over time, as the frontal lobe develops, it helps you to make a response rather than a reaction. And what they found was that as people prayed consistently, their frontal lobe began to change. And not only did the frontal lobe begin to change, but the person actually became more empathetic, more compassionate, more loving, more others-focused. They admitted to having less stress, less anxiety, and they felt as though they were becoming the best version of themselves. And in this series, we've been taking a look at the ingredients that make up a great church and what it looks like when we let Jesus do what Jesus does best in our life. And today we'll be wrapping up this series with the final ingredient, influence daily. Now, there's a story in the book of Matthew when Jesus calls the first disciples. He's walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he sees two brothers, they're fishermen, Simon Peter and Andrew. Jesus is walking along, and he says, "Hey, come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And when they heard this, they immediately dropped their nets, and they went and they followed Jesus. Does that seem strange? It seems strange, right? In our current context, trying to play out this scenario, it just doesn't really add up. So it's really important for us to understand the context in which this story took place. Simon Peter and Andrew were Jewish men. In the Jewish tradition, it was common for the highly educated men to become rabbis or teachers. Now, this was way back before information was so readily available, and so most people depended on these rabbis and teachers to learn what God wanted them to do, learn how God wanted them to live their life. And the vast majority of people were illiterate. So they couldn't sit and read the scriptures. They depended on these rabbis and their teaching. So it was common practice for Jewish men to be invited by these rabbis to learn their teaching. So for Jesus to walk up to Simon Peter and Andrew and say, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men," that was really a common practice for these guys. But for uneducated fishermen, it was kind of a big deal to get an invitation from Jesus like that, because even though rabbis invited people to learn their teaching, uneducated fishermen were not usually their first choice of who they wanted to teach. So knowing that, I can understand why Simon Peter and Andrew, after hearing this invitation, would drop everything, that they would leave and they would go and follow Jesus. And they probably had some idea of who Jesus was. Jesus had just started his ministry and had been performing some miracles. There were whispers around the town, but they truly did not know what they were signing up for, and yet they left everything behind. And this invitation of rabbis and the invitation of Jesus was really not just about becoming educated in the scriptures. It was truly an opportunity to become a disciple or an apprentice of the rabbi, which meant that from the time that they got the invitation, "Come and follow me, learn my teachings," they would leave everything behind and spend every waking moment learning how to follow the scriptures and become like their rabbi. So the story continues, and we see Jesus calling more people to follow him, more disciples. And it's the same response time after time after time. "Come and follow me." And they leave everything they have known and they follow Jesus. And Jesus continues to invite the guys that would be picked last: fishermen, tax collectors, people that the elite and the uneducated didn't want to be associated with. But regardless, the invitation was the same. So jump ahead to our current context, and the invitation of Jesus is the same for you and me today. Come and follow me. And now that we have some understanding of what that meant in Jesus' day, what does that mean for us today? Like it or not, all of us are a disciple of something or someone. And I know that we all like to think that we have total control in our lives, but if we're honest, we'll quickly come to the realization that there's very little in our life that we can actually control. Think back with me to the study in the beginning that I mentioned. The brain is constantly being shaped by our experiences, whether we think about them or not. Meaning your brain is taking in signals, even as I'm talking to you, taking in signals from the environment and the people around you, and creating pathways in your mind that change the way that you see and think about the world around you. And Paul actually understood this concept when he was writing to the church in Rome about how to follow Jesus in their current context. Paul says this in Romans 12:2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing, perfect will. And Paul is writing to the church in Rome, knowing that in their culture and in their practices, they are already becoming Roman without much thought. In Greek, the words for conforming and transforming are in the present passive tense, meaning these are things that are already actively happening to you. You are either being conformed to this world or you are being transformed by Jesus, and there's no other option. So what Paul is trying to get them to understand is that conforming is already actively happening in their life, but transforming is the result of an intentional choice to follow the way of Jesus, and the same is true for us today. To follow Jesus means actively choosing not to follow everything else. Let me put it another way. There are no accidental followers of Jesus. It's a choice that you and I get to make every single day. And you can be exposed to Jesus and his way of life by coming to church on Sunday, every Sunday, and that is a good thing. Trust me when I say I want you to continue to do that. Show up on Sundays. Be exposed to the way of Jesus. But unless you begin to practice, to implement the way of Jesus into your daily life, you won't experience the deepest transformation that is possible in your life. In John 10:10, we read the words of Jesus, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." In choosing to follow Jesus, we begin to experience transformation in our life that isn't just behavior modification. It's a new way of living. And following Jesus is so much more than a list of do's and don'ts. It's a way of life. That's why in the early church, the Christians who followed Jesus after his death on the cross and his resurrection from the grave, they called themselves followers of the way, as a way of reminding themselves that Jesus is the way to God, but also to help them orient their lives around the way of Jesus, to remember this is a new thing that we're doing. This is a new way of living. I need to remember this and keep it at the forefront of my mind. So as we think about this idea of conforming or transforming, we have to ask ourselves a few questions. The natural first question that we would ask would be, who am I following? But before we can actually answer that question of who am I following, we have to take a step back and we need to ask ourselves, who am I becoming? And as we take an honest look at the way that we live our lives and the thoughts and feelings and beliefs that are deep down in our hearts, it actually gives us the answer to the question, who am I following? Because if your answer to the question, who am I becoming, is actually, I'm a pretty angry person. I struggle with dishonesty and hate. Or I think about what's in it for me more than I think about other people. I'm discontent. Or maybe your answer is, I feel like I'm generally a good person, but I don't know that my life actually has value or meaning. These things all point to our human nature. What Paul calls in Galatians works of the flesh. And as we take inventory of our lives and we ask the question, who am I becoming? We'll find that the way that you live actually answers the question, who am I following? Our actions directly point toward who or what is leading our life. And Jesus made this abundantly clear to the disciples in one of his final moments with them before he went to the cross. Jesus said this in John 13:34. He says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, All people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And as Jesus says this, he knows that these are the final moments that he has with his disciples before he would be betrayed by his disciple Judas and handed over to die on a cross. So don't these words hold a different weight? After all of the travel that they did together, all of Jesus' teachings and the miracles that he performed, Jesus takes a moment to really try and get this through their brains and into their heart, that the way that they love others would be the evidence of choosing to follow him. That would be the clearest difference between those who follow Jesus and those who follow anyone or anything else. Now let's shift gears for a moment and let's talk about fruit. I know it's really random. Does anyone here have experience with gardening or planting your own fruit? Okay, I am actually going to plant raspberry bushes and blackberry bushes, and actually as I am talking about this, I'm just realizing that they got delivered yesterday and they're in my garage. So I'm off to a really good start. But if you know a thing or two about plants and gardening, you'll know that certain types of trees or bushes produce certain types of fruit. A lemon tree produces lemons. The raspberry bush in my garage, if I take care of it, will produce raspberries, right? And Paul actually uses this concept to demonstrate what the Spirit produces in us as we follow Jesus. He writes this in Galatians 5:22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And just like a lemon tree produces lemons, when we make Jesus the Lord and leader of our life, the Spirit produces these things within us. And earlier in this section in Galatians, Paul says to walk by the Spirit, meaning let your entire life be changed by Jesus and the Holy Spirit so that over time you can become more and more like Jesus. But how does this happen? Wait for it. It's a really, really profound answer. Practice. Practice. The study that we talked about in the beginning helped us to see that consistent prayer and worship does have an impact on us. Literally, within our brain, there are changes made to help us become the best version of ourselves. So as you spend time intentionally practicing the way of Jesus, connecting with Jesus, loving others, praying, worshiping, serving, these things create pathways in your brain that information travels down much quicker than if your time with Jesus is sporadic or non-existent. And like we talked about learning to ride a bike, the more and more that you practice, the more natural it becomes, and your life will begin to transform. There's this really great and simple way to sum all of this up, because I'm sure as you're sitting here listening to me, you're like, okay, that's great, but how? Like, what do I actually do? Well, here are 3 words that you can take home with you and start to implement this week as you choose to follow Jesus. They're be, become, do. And I wish that I could take credit for this, but John Mark Comer, the founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, he actually summed up this really big topic into these 3 words to make it more practical for you and me. So as you follow Jesus, these 3 words give us the steps to take to become more like Jesus. And let's break this down, okay? First is be. Be with Jesus. As the disciples responded to the invitation of Jesus to come and follow, they spent every waking minute with Jesus, learning the way that he lived, learning his character, growing in their friendship with him, and growing in trust of him. The starting point of their discipleship was just being around Jesus and in relationship with him. And I used to serve in our youth ministry, and one of the most common statistics that we would share with the youth is that you become like the 5 people that you spend the most time with. So it makes sense that at the beginning stage of following Jesus, it would just be to spend time with him. Spending time with Jesus can look like a lot of different things. And let me just give you some freedom and say that it doesn't have to be early in the morning as the sun rises with that fresh, hot cup of coffee and 0 interruptions. Although, as a mom of 2 young kids, that sounds absolutely glorious. But it doesn't have to be like that. Being with Jesus can be done all throughout our day, with our family, with our friends, by ourselves. It can be done in long moments of prayer or small prayers all throughout the day that add up. It can be done through reading scripture and singing or in silence. There isn't one right way to spend time with Jesus. What's important is that you are consistent in spending time with him. And just like we shared with the youth, you become like the 5 people that you spend the most time with. So as you practice being with Jesus, you naturally move to the next word and become like Jesus. And it's in this stage that you really begin to see transformation happen in your life. Do you remember the fruit? As you spend time with Jesus, the Spirit begins to produce love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control in your life. So when a situation doesn't go the way that you hoped, instead of worry being your natural reaction, your natural response becomes peace. And when your kids are fighting in the back seat of the car as someone cuts you off on the freeway, instead of yelling at your kids and flipping off the car that just cut you off, you'll find yourself practicing patience and self-control. That is tough, okay? I'm standing up here as someone who has to practice this with you, okay? Literally last week, I had a moment where I was driving my kids home. They're both screaming in the back seat, and I took a corner a little too fast, but my phone holder actually flew off from the dash, and it went all across the car. My phone fell off. My kids are screaming, and in that moment, I really just wanted to yell, just like get the feelings out. But instead, I started to stress sing. Does anyone stress sing? That's just a thing that I do. I don't know. But I started to stress sing a song from VeggieTales, which was a show I watched as a kid. Vegetables teaching kids about Jesus, that's the best way. But I started to sing this song in the chaos. I sang, because a thankful heart is a happy heart. I'm glad for what I have. That's an easy way to start. I don't always get it right. Sometimes I do yell. And I have to go and I have to apologize to my kids later. But as we become like Jesus and practice the way of Jesus, it becomes more natural in those moments to choose a different response. And as we continue to become like Jesus, the natural progression is to do what Jesus did. This is where our ingredient of influence daily comes into play. Our life will look different as we choose to follow Jesus. There's just no way around it. As we spend time learning his ways, becoming like him, and choosing to let Jesus do what Jesus does best, which is transform our hearts, we can't help but live differently. And suddenly, the filter through which we see and do everything is Jesus. And it becomes much more natural for us to love our neighbors, to pray for those who hurt us, to forgive, to serve as a way of life, to live and give generously, to put others above ourselves, and love in such a way that people know that Jesus is the one that we follow. There's this story in John where Jesus serves his disciples in a way that they can't even fully comprehend. The guys are all together, all of the disciples and Jesus, and they're sharing a meal to celebrate the Passover. This was a celebration because they took time to remember how God had brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery from Egypt. So they're together, and I feel like I imagine this scene kind of being like a mixture of Thanksgiving and the Super Bowl, where they've got the full spread of food, it's good, they're eating probably more than they should, and they have the energy and excitement as if their team just won the Super Bowl. They're loving it. They're spending time together with their friends. And then all of a sudden, Jesus stands up, and the room goes quiet. And they just look at him like, okay, what are you going to do? We're having a good time. What's going on, Jesus? And Jesus steps up, and he takes a towel, and he ties it around his waist. And they're just watching and waiting, trying to figure out what he's going to do. When Jesus takes a basin and some water and he starts to pour. And then he walks up to the first disciple and he gets down on his knees and he starts to wash the disciples' feet. Wouldn't that be weird? You're just watching and having a good time and Jesus comes up and he's like, scrubbing your feet. Now, this is really a significant moment for a couple of reasons, but the first is that this job of washing feet was the job of a servant. If you think that the roads in Spokane are bad, the roads that Jesus and his disciples traveled were worse. Dirt, dust, grime, sweat, and the shoe of choice was made out of rope and leather. Their feet were disgusting. They were absolutely disgusting. So it was common practice when you had guests in your home to have your servant come and wash the feet of your guests. It was an act of hospitality and service to them. So these guys are looking around, and Jesus continues to wash their feet, and they're all just feeling kind of nervous and weird. And then Peter, the loud and outspoken disciple, he jumps up and he says, "Lord, do you wash my feet? You'll never wash my feet." Because Peter knew that this was a job not to be done by someone of importance, much less God himself. And then Jesus looks at Peter, and he says, "If I don't do this, you don't belong to me." And suddenly Peter, hearing that, he goes, "Okay, well then not just my feet, but my hands and my head too." Because that was typical Peter, just going above and beyond in everything. But hunched down low, Jesus takes the position of a servant. And he scrubs the dirt off the bottom of their feet that's caked on. The grit, the grime. I'm sure they had scrapes and blood, and it was dirty and disgusting. This wasn't a situation like when you go to OMG Nails this week on Sullivan to celebrate your mom for Mother's Day. It wasn't like that. The guys weren't sitting. It didn't smell good. They weren't leaning to each other like, "What do you think Judas is going to do tonight?" You know? They weren't gossiping. They were sitting in silence, watching their Lord and their leader scrub their feet. And after this, Jesus stands up and he looks at them and he asks them this question. He says, "Do you understand what I have just done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and that's who I am. You're right. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you." And if you're wondering what it means to do what Jesus did, the example that he gives in this story is one of humility, of sacrifice, and of service. And it's shortly after this story that Jesus is betrayed by Judas, and he's handed over to die a brutal death on the cross for us. And you might not like to hear this, but ultimately doing what Jesus did means dying to yourself. In Luke 9:23, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. And what I love about this, I think it's so beautiful and incredible that Jesus isn't asking us to do something that he didn't already do himself. He was the ultimate sacrifice. He paid the price. He lived his way as a servant. He demonstrated love for them. He showed us the example, and then he invites us to do the same. He's not sitting up in the sky saying, you do this. He's right here with us saying, I've washed your feet. I've paid the price for you. And now I'm inviting you to live out this transformation, this change, and do the same for others. To take up our cross daily means to choose not to follow the things within us that aren't like Jesus, and instead say, here I am. Show me how to love the people in my neighborhood today. Show me how to serve my family today. Teach me to be patient and give me peace that only comes from you. Make me more like you, Jesus. Our youth have a motto that they say every single week when they meet together on Wednesdays and Sundays, and it's, I am the one that God wants to use to change the world. And I just love that because it's true for you today too. You are the one that God wants to use to change the world. And the way that he does that is by changing you. Because as we practice this model of be, become, do, our life changes. And the way that we love shows the world around us that we follow Jesus, that there's a better way. So let's ask ourselves this morning, does the way that I am currently living my life point the people around me toward Jesus? How would your life be different if you chose today to say, here I am. Make me more like you, Jesus.